Good evening, and hello again. Today we are heading south, up the Nile, past the famous Egyptian pyramids, through golden deserts and quiet banks, into a land just as ancient, just as powerful, and often forgotten. This is the story of Ancient Nubia, a kingdom of Black Pharaohs, sacred mountains, warrior queens, and thriving cities built along the river's most vital artery. As always, I'm very interested to know what part of the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are resting after a long day or slowly drifting off to sleep, I hope this story brings you peace and curiosity in equal measure. It is a history carved in stone and sand, a history thousands of years old, and today it is all yours. To understand ancient Nubia, you must first forget everything you were taught about geography. Most people tend to think of the Nile as a river that neatly flows from the interior of Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea, perhaps pausing at a pyramid or a palm tree occasionally, and then continuing on its stately way. But the Nile is not such a polite waterway. It is stubborn, ancient, and incredibly long, starting far to the south in the lakes of Central Africa, and fighting its way north through rocky gorges and dry sands that have seen kingdoms rise and fall more often than most rivers can dream of.
Somewhere along this route lies the stretch of river known for most of documented history as Nubia. And it is here, amidst the cataracts and cliffs, that one of the most remarkable civilizations you probably haven't heard much about was born. Long before the Egyptians carved their first hieroglyph or stacked their first stone, the people of Nubia were already settled along the riverbanks, tending cattle and raising crops in the nourishing silt left behind by the Nile's floods. We are talking about events more than 7,000 years ago, when the Sahara still held lakes and pastures, and herds of gazelles would have roamed freely in the shade of sparse trees. The climate then was much milder. When it began to grow drier around 5000 BCE, people and their animals were drawn to the water, flocking to the river valleys like beads sliding down an inclined board. And in Nubia, they stayed. In some ways, it was the perfect location. The river offered fish and irrigation, the rocks held minerals, the savanna to the south yielded elephants and ivory, and anyone who could master this long, narrow land between Egypt and Central Africa held an undeniable advantage in trade and travel that few other regions could rival. The Egyptians, by the way, knew this too. They called the land to their south Ta-Seti, which means the land of the bow, in honor of the extraordinary skill of the Nubian archers, who would one day form entire contingents in the Egyptian armies, and whose bravery was so intimidating that it became a national stereotype. But Nubia was never merely a supplier of mercenaries. They had cattle herders long before Egypt. They had polished, black-topped pottery that archaeologists still scratch their heads over in admiration. And they had early settlements, such as the cultures named A Group and C Group, whose burial customs and trade patterns tell us that a distinct society was taking root here, while the pharaohs were still figuring out how to build mastabas. These early Nubians were no less spiritual than their northern neighbors. Their grave goods suggest a belief in the afterlife. Their diet, based on sorghum and wild grains, indicates a deep understanding of their land. And their connection to sub-Saharan Africa meant they were part of a much older, broader human history than anything happening in the Nile Delta. The modern border between Egypt and Sudan cuts through this region like a bureaucrat's careless stroke of a pen. But in ancient times, no such division existed. There was only the river and the people living along it, navigating its moods and its muddy banks. If you were standing on a hill overlooking the Nile somewhere around 3500 BCE, You might have seen dugout canoes gliding through the reeds, herds of long-horned cattle kicking up dust clouds across the floodplain, and women grinding grain in the shade of acacia trees. You would have heard laughter, bartering, perhaps the clanging of stone tools. In short, you would have seen civilization, not a shadow of Egypt, not a footnote, but the roots of something entirely rich, resilient, and long deserving of center stage.
If ancient Egypt was the jewel of the Nile, the Nubia was its chain, the long and winding corridor through which people, goods, beliefs, and sometimes entire armies passed. What made Nubia so remarkable, even in its earliest chapters, was not just that it existed next to Egypt, but that it did so with a quiet confidence and its own cultural identity. It occupied one of the most geologically dramatic and strategically important stretches of the Nile. This was no leisurely riverbank dotted with lilies and pleasure boats. Instead, the Nubian section of the river was interrupted by a series of turbulent cataracts, where the water rushed and foamed through granite outcroppings and cut circuitous paths through narrow gorges. There were 6 main cataracts in total, like natural gates on the river, each one marking a kind of chapter in the geography of power. For a civilization to thrive here, it needed to be resilient, mobile, inventive, and intensely attuned to the river's moods and the land's demands. And it did thrive. From the beginning, Nubia was defined by what passed through it. Caravans of merchants traveled through the region in free-flowing columns, bringing gold from the eastern mines, frankincense from the Red Sea coast, ivory from the forests to the south, and exotic skins and ostrich feathers from as far away as modern Chad. The land itself was rich in resources, and this made it valuable to others, sometimes overly attractive. The Egyptians, from the earliest dynastic times, seemed to look upon Nubia with a certain condescending envy, as if it were a younger brother with better toys. Egyptian officials sent expeditions into Nubia, not just to trade, but to extract. They mined its gold, they hunted its game, they enslaved its people, and built a series of fortresses throughout the region, like beads on a necklace, to monitor the flow of treasures up the Nile. But the Nubians were never merely passive recipients of Egyptian whims. What we see in the archaeological data is a much subtler story. Early Nubian cultures were distinct, but not isolationist. They certainly absorbed and adopted Egyptian ideas, but they also pushed their own influences north. Artifacts from Nubia have been found in early Egyptian tombs, and there is compelling evidence that the Nubians developed complex social and religious structures long before they were absorbed into any Egyptian political orbit. Their pottery styles were their own, their burial customs unique, and their cattle culture, this is important, was one of the earliest known in Africa, predating the appearance of pastoralism in many neighboring regions. For the Nubians, cattle were not just animals, but spiritual and social currency. They were offered in rituals, buried alongside the elite, and revered as symbols of wealth and power. You could write a whole book just on how they positioned the horns. And then there was the matter of identity. One of the great myths perpetuated by early historians, and unfortunately still repeated in some school textbooks, is that Nubia was a kind of lesser Egypt, a footnote to the great pharaonic narrative. But this is a profound misconception. Nubia, even before it became a formal kingdom, had its own languages, its own pantheon of deities, and its own centers of power. These were not primitive tribes being civilized by their northern neighbors. These were river people, settled and sophisticated, whose art and architecture reveal a worldview that was both familiar and distinct. Debate still continues about the earliest political organization in the region, but settlements such as Kustul suggest the presence of royal iconography, scepters, crowns, ceremonial motifs, which indicates that traditions of kingship were taking root here as early as, or perhaps even earlier than in Egypt. And while we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle yet, we know enough to say there was a Nubian civilization worthy of the name before Egypt annexed its first outpost there. This annexation, when it occurred, was less of a sudden storm and more of a slow tide. By the time Egypt's Old Kingdom reached its height, the Egyptians had established a more or less permanent presence in parts of Lower Nubia, building garrisons and administrative posts that facilitated the flow of gold and other goods. Egyptian inscriptions of the time speak the language of conquest, but archaeology tells a more subtle story. There was resistance. There were local leaders who negotiated their position. There were mixed marriages, trade partnerships, shared sanctuaries, and probably no small amount of verbal skirmishes across the temple courtyards. In short, it was what borderlands always are: complex. Through all of this, the Nubians adapted with a certain quiet resilience. They maintained their traditions. Even as the Egyptians knocked, they mastered new skills. Their artisans blended Egyptian forms with local motifs, creating objects that were both elegant and unmistakably Southern in character. Their warriors became known not only for their archery, but also for their tenacity. Even the Egyptians, with their famously high self-regard, had to admit that Nubian soldiers were worth hiring, and perhaps not worth needlessly provoking. Many were hired as mercenaries in the Egyptian armies, and some eventually became palace guards, police, and even government officials. It's not hard to imagine a Nubian archer assigned to the royal palace in Thebes, proudly wearing Egyptian linen, but silently dreaming of home. And the river still flowed. It carried not only goods and people, but also ideas. Religion traveled up and down the Nile like a migratory bird. Deities were exchanged, merged, borrowed, and repurposed. The Nubians had their own gods, but they also adopted some Egyptian ones, especially Amun, whose worship would later flourish in the southern temples, even as it declined in the north. But again, the borrowing was not one-sided. It is entirely possible, and increasingly acknowledged in some scholarly circles, that some of the gods the Egyptians held sacred had Nubian roots. In a region where stone was scarce, but symbolism was abundant, temples sprang up along the riverbanks. Many of them were later rebuilt by successive rulers. Their paint has faded, but their meaning has endured. By the time Nubia enters the more formalized historical record, when we begin to see named kings, coordinated building, and long-distance diplomacy, it is already a land with a deep past and a layered identity. It is a place that absorbed Egyptian aggression without losing its character, a place that contributed more than it received, and a place that would, in time, reverse the flow of history. For while the Egyptians once looked south and saw only a source of gold and soldiers, it wouldn't be long before they would look south and see a line of kings wearing the double crown of Egypt itself. But all of that is for later. For now, we stand on the riverbank, sometime in the 3rd millennium BCE, watching the setting sun sparkle on the tips of a cattle herd's horns, listening to the quiet splash of fishing nets being pulled from the shallows, and feeling the ancient current of a civilization that refuses to be forgotten. This is Nubia, the land of the bow, and it is only just beginning its journey. If you could somehow travel back to around 1700 BCE and stand atop a ridge near the 3rd cataract of the Nile, just before the river begins one of its more complex bends through the Nubian landscape, you would see something quite astonishing there. Spread out across a broad floodplain would be the city of Kerma, a capital unlike any other in the ancient world at that time. To the left, fields of barley would wave in the wind. Ahead, cattle pens would stretch into the distance, dotted with long-horned bulls prized for their size and beauty. But what would truly catch your eye is the enormous looming structure dominating everything. A sun-baked, towering mud brick fortress known today as the Western Defufa. The word means mud brick building, and funnily enough, sounds like something a 4-year-old invented. It was a temple, and it was colossal. And it meant that something very serious was happening at Kerma. Kerma was not an outpost, a colony, or a dusty village lost in the folds of history. It was a state capital, the beating heart of the first truly centralized Nubian kingdom. And for several centuries, it rivaled Egypt in both power and sophistication. Its roots ran deep, growing out of the local pastoral cultures that had lived in the region for millennia, slowly evolving from scattered settlements into what archaeologists sometimes call an urban complex. Though this doesn't capture the true scale and ambition of what Kerma became. It was a city with royal tombs the size of football fields, workshops for bronze and gold, granaries, housing for thousands of people, and walls thick enough to deter raiders or at least make them think twice. What makes Kerma even more remarkable is how little it borrowed from Egypt. This civilization did not define itself by imitating its northern neighbor. It had its own architectural forms, its own religious practices, and its own unmistakably distinct material culture. For example, its pottery was black-topped and polished to such a sheen that it looks almost metallic today, like something out of a modern design studio in Berlin. Its burial traditions were elaborate and often involved the sacrificial killing of retainers who were interred alongside their rulers in massive circular tombs ringed with the skulls of cattle. That last detail may sound grim, and it is, but it also reflects a worldview where kings were not merely human leaders, but mediators between the people and the divine, shepherds of prosperity who required an entire household in the afterlife. Even the Egyptians, no strangers to lavish tombs, would have been taken aback by the grandeur and scale of Kerma's royal cemetery. Politically, Kerma controlled a significant stretch of the Nile Valley, at least from the Second Cataract in the north down to the Fourth, and possibly even the Fifth in the south. This gave the kingdom access to trade routes that reached deep into Africa, bringing exotic goods, giraffe tails, panther skins, incense, ebony, and exporting Nubia's most desired resource, gold. The hills to the east of the river held rich deposits, and the rulers of Kerma mined and traded it with great enthusiasm. Egyptian inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom speak with thinly veiled envy of the fabulous wealth of the south. And it is easy to see why. Gold in those days was not just wealth, it was divine. It adorned the gods, it lined the tombs, it conferred legitimacy on kings, and the Nubians had it in abundance. Inevitably, this made Kerma both a trading partner and a threat. During periods when Egypt was strong and unified, such as during the reign of Senusret III, pharaohs pushed south and built fortresses on Nubian land, seeking to control the gold trade and secure the border. But during times of Egyptian weakness, such as the Second Intermediate Period, the tables turned dramatically. There is strong evidence that the kings of Kerma formed alliances with Egyptians' northern enemies, the Hyksos, and launched military campaigns into Upper Egypt. One of these campaigns was so successful that a later Egyptian ruler had to march south and destroy Kerma in retaliation. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The important point is that for nearly 500 years, Kerma was a major force in the Nile Valley, a thriving and fiercely independent kingdom that dealt with Egypt on its own terms. It absorbed what it found useful, ignored what it didn't, and maintained a culture that was unmistakably Nubian. Its language remains undeciphered, and much about its religious beliefs is still a mystery, but its accomplishments speak for themselves. The western Defufa, nearly 20 meters high, is still visible today, Its massive bricks stubbornly resist the sun and wind nearly 4,000 years after they were laid. The tombs of its kings still yield treasures and secrets with every new excavation, and its influence can be traced for centuries to come as the memory of Kerma helped shape what would become the Kingdom of Kush. So the next time someone tells you that ancient civilization in Africa began and ended with the pyramids of Egypt, gently take them by the elbow, lead them to a map, and point to the long curve of the Nile south of Aswan. Then tell them about the city of mud and cattle, of bronze tools and sun-drenched temples, of a people who built their own kingdom and held it proudly and magnificently until the sands of time and the wrath of the pharaohs swept it into legend. Kerma, for all its elegance and power, was not built in isolation. It owed its wealth and resilience to a remarkable combination of geographical fortune, ecological abundance, and a flair for political flexibility. You might not think that cattle are capable of changing the course of a civilization, but in Nubia, they did. These were not merely livestock, they were walking bank accounts, religious symbols, social statements, and sometimes rather inconvenient companions in the grave. The Nubians of Kerma developed a deep, almost spiritual connection to their long-horned cattle. Herds were carefully bred, ceremonially displayed, and in many cases buried alongside their owners, either whole or in part. It was uncommon to find the skulls of dozens, even hundreds of cattle arranged in ritual circles around the royal tombs, like a mute, bone-white audience bearing witness to the king's journey into the afterlife. Cattle wealth was so central to Kerma that scholars sometimes describe the society as a pastoral state, which in practice meant that whoever controlled the herds controlled the power. But there was more here than just cattle and pottery. Kerma was deeply integrated into the economic chain of Northeast Africa. Its location near the Third Cataract was ideal for controlling the flow of goods along the Nile. Traders moving north from sub-Saharan Africa had to pass through Kerma's domain, as did gold miners from the eastern desert, ivory merchants from the forest edge, and camel caravans laden with frankincense and hides. All roads, or rather all river channels, led to Kerma, and with every passing consignment, the kingdom grew stronger, wealthier, and more confident in its place in the world. Egyptian records from the Middle Kingdom and the Second Intermediate period frequently mention Kerma, not always affectionately. They speak of its people as enemies, but also as necessary trade partners. They cursed the vile Kushites, but secretly coveted their iron-tipped spears, their formidable archers, and the seemingly endless flow of goods that streamed north from their kingdom. What complicates the picture is that Kerma and Egypt were never absolute enemies or absolute allies. Their relationship shifted with the tides of history. During periods of Egyptian strength, such as the reign of Senusret III, the pharaohs resorted to a more assertive approach. They built a line of military fortresses between the First and Second Cataracts, some of them architectural marvels in their own right. Mud brick citadels with thick defensive walls, watchtowers, and garrisons of soldiers tasked with keeping the Nubians in check. These were not mere forts. They were customs stations, checkpoints, intelligence posts, and cultural outposts designed to project Egyptian influence deep into Nubian territory. But the further south you went, the less Egypt could control. Beyond the Second Cataract, in the very heartland of Kerma, Egyptian power waned. The further the pharaoh's arm stretched, the more it trembled. Then came the Second Intermediate period, a phase in Egyptian history so chaotic that modern political scandals seem quaint. Egypt fractured into rival dynasties, and the powerful Hyksos, a foreign people from the Levant, seized control of the delta. With Egypt divided and distracted, Kerma saw its chance. There is strong evidence that the kings of Kerma allied themselves with the Hyksos, forming a kind of pincer movement against Thebes,
the last major Egyptian stronghold in the south. Kerma's armies marched north, possibly to conquer, possibly to plunder, and may have reached the ancient city of Asyut. This was the moment of Nubia's greatest northern reach. For a brief, glorious time, in the middle of the 16th century BCE, Kerma stood not merely as a southern kingdom, but as a genuine contender for supremacy in the Nile Valley. That window, however, slammed shut with sudden and terrible force. When the Thebans finally rallied and drove out the Hyksos, they did not forget who had supported their enemies. One of the most formidable Theban pharaohs, Thutmose I, launched a massive campaign south around 1500 BCE. This was not merely a punitive raid, it was a full-scale invasion. The Egyptian army swept through Lower Nubia, burning villages, dismantling forts, and eventually reaching Kerma itself. The city was sacked, its palaces and temples desecrated, its people slaughtered or enslaved. The capital of the Kingdom of Kush, the first great Nubian kingdom, was brought to its knees by the very power it had once threatened to overtake. It is tempting to end the story there, in the smoldering ruins of Kerma. But history is not a straight line, and defeat is rarely the end. Though the city was destroyed, its legacy endured. Many of its customs, artistic styles, and religious practices would find new life in the centuries to come. More importantly, the memory of a united, powerful Nubian kingdom that stood toe-to-toe with Egypt would not be forgotten. It would inspire new leaders rising out of the sands of Napata and Meroë, who would one day not only rival Egypt, but rule it. Kerma, for all its elegance and power, may have fallen to the wrath of the pharaohs, but its bones still lie beneath the Sudanese soil, its temples sunken and silent, its pottery intact after 3.5 millennia.
If you were a Nubian farmer living somewhere near the Third Cataract around 1450 BCE, life might have felt jarringly off-kilter. Not so long ago, your land belonged to the Kingdom of Kerma. Your kings ruled from the mud-brick capital, where sacred bulls grazed in temple courtyards and princes drank beer from polished black vessels. Now the important men wore linen kilts and spoke in a clipped northern tongue. They built stone temples that looked as though they had been ripped from another world and misplaced into yours. And high above them, etched onto the temple pylons and the rock faces, were boastful inscriptions in precise hieroglyphs announcing that you, your river, your cattle, and your gods now belonged to Egypt. This was the Age of Empire. After the destruction of Kerma, the Egyptians, under Thutmose I and his successors, did not stop at revenge. They stayed, and with them came a deliberate, calculated effort to absorb Nubia into the Egyptian worldview. It was not an annexation in name only. It was a full-scale colonial project that lasted for almost 500 years. Egyptian officials were sent to govern the Nubian districts. Soldiers garrisoned the forts, and tax agents kept meticulous records of everything from cattle head counts to the weight of the grain tribute. But this is only the surface view. Beneath it, something else was happening, something slower and more subtle. While the Egyptians believed they were civilizing the South, the Nubians were adapting, absorbing, and preserving their core. It is vital to understand that the Nubians were not wiped out or replaced. Yes, they were ruled and heavily influenced, but they were still here, working their fields, herding their cattle, and watching the newcomers with keen eyes. Many likely attended the Egyptian temples, or at least pretended to. Some served in the Egyptian army, especially as archers, a role the Nubians had long excelled at. Others rose through the ranks of the colonial administration, adopting Egyptian names and customs, even while passing on stories and songs from the older, native world. It is in this period that Nubian society began to acquire its unique character. Not fully Egyptian and not fully native, but something in between. Some scholars call this Egyptianization, but that suggests a passive process, like clay taking the shape of a mold. It would be more accurate to call it a negotiation or a cultural transaction. The Nubians took what they found useful. They revered Amun, but they did so with their own regional flavor. They would eventually build pyramids, but they would make them their own way, steeper, smaller, more intimate. Even in death, their kings would combine the symbols of two worlds. This hybrid culture, born in the crucible of occupation, would one day develop into a civilization strong enough to challenge its former masters. But that is still in the future. For now, in the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, Egypt controlled Nubia as tightly as any colonial empire. They built roads and temples. They levied labor. They sent artists and scribes to decorate the rocks with grandiose statements of conquest. They mined Nubian gold with tireless enthusiasm. And gold, it turns out, was the central goal. Nubia was famed for it. Egyptian inscriptions speak of it almost longingly, describing rivers where gold nuggets glittered in the silt, or hills that literally bled ore. The region's gold fueled Egyptian temples, paid for armies, and gilded the statues of their gods. In many ways, Egypt's empire rested on Nubian minerals. And yet, even with this control, Egypt never managed to erase the idea of Nubia. They ruled it, they claimed to civilize it, but deep in the villages, beyond the reach of the tax collectors and the temple processions, the old ways persisted. Cattle still held their sacred place. Local dialects survived, even if hieroglyphs were carved on public stone. And the mountains, those jagged, stubborn teeth of rock rising next to the Nile, still echoed with stories that were never written down, but never forgotten. It was in these margins, these quiet spaces between the lines of imperial propaganda, that Nubian identity was preserved, not loudly, but resiliently. While Egyptian officials congratulated themselves on their civilizing mission, while the pharaohs carved their names into temple facades and declared the south theirs forever, Nubia quietly waited, waiting for Egypt's power to falter, waiting for its own traditions to coalesce, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And it would. From a purely administrative standpoint, Egypt's conquest of Nubia was a marvel of imperial efficiency. After Kerma was razed and its royal cemetery silenced beneath the scorched earth, the pharaohs turned the region into something very much like a client state. They renamed it Wawat and Kush, depending on which stretch of the river was being referenced, and immediately set about turning the rugged land into a well-oiled economic machine. The strategy was surprisingly modern. Consolidate control at key points, build fortresses to enforce that control, appoint bureaucrats to obsessively count everything, and plaster the landscape with temples that solemnly, in grand limestone, declared who was in charge. Egyptian officials, many of them with shaved heads and an alarming attachment to papyrus scrolls, set up shop in places like Eniba, Sai Island, and Soleb, where they proceeded to tax, inspect, and control everything that moved. They collected tribute in the form of grain, cattle, and gold, which was then shipped north to Thebes or Memphis to satisfy the insatiable appetites of temples and court feasts. Merchants were watched, smelters were regulated, and cattle herders were encouraged to register their herds with state scribes. To facilitate all this activity, Egypt created administrative centers staffed by a mixed crew, Egyptians and locally appointed Nubians, who, if they wanted to remain in the pharaoh's good graces, learned to wear Egyptian clothing, speak the language of the Egyptian court, and worship in Egyptian temples. But for all this display of control, a strange thing began to happen. The more Egypt embedded itself in Nubia, the more it inadvertently exported its culture southward. At first, it looked like a success story. The Nubians began to adopt Egyptian religious forms with surprising enthusiasm. They built temples that copied Theban blueprints, complete with pylons and hypostyle halls. They worshipped Egyptian gods, especially Amun, whose cult would find some of its most fervent supporters not in Egypt, but in the far reaches of Nubia. The New Kingdom kings introduced Amun as a kind of divine patron of the empire. But in Nubia, he became something even more powerful, a symbol of legitimacy, a divine witness to royal power, and ultimately a unifying figure for independence. The most remarkable site of this transformation was Jebel Barkal, a sacred mountain near the later Nubian city of Napata. The Egyptians believed it was Amun's southern home, the spot where the god had stepped onto the earth during his journey. Whether the Nubians agreed initially or not, they quickly embraced the idea, and over the centuries, Jebel Barkal became one of the holiest sites in the Kushite world. Temples were carved into its slopes, and kings would later claim their divine right to rule from its sandstone heights. In a rather poetic irony, Egypt exported its religion so effectively that it created a sacred landscape outside its own borders, a landscape that would one day turn against it. Meanwhile, the populace was not idle. While Egyptian control remained solid along the riverbanks and in the major settlements, the wider interior was still largely Nubian in practice and spirit. Village elders passed down oral histories that remembered Kerma's glory. Women adorned themselves with local jewelry and sang songs in the old language. Farmers continued their ancient patterns of crop rotation and cattle grazing along the floodplains, as their ancestors had for generations. Egyptian officials may have believed they were bringing civilization to the Nubians, but they often didn't know or care that the Nubians already had one. It just didn't fit the scrolls in their state archives. In time, as with all empires, Egypt's grip began to loosen. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt itself was in decline. The 20th dynasty crumbled under its own weight, exhausted by economic strain, internal corruption, and a string of pharaohs with increasingly forgettable names and shorter reigns. As Egypt turned inward to deal with the invasions of the Sea Peoples and squabbles between priests and generals, it began to quietly withdraw from Nubia. Garrisons thinned out. Temples remained, but they were no longer regularly maintained. Tax records went uncollected. Local rulers, Nubians trained in Egyptian systems and raised on Egyptian religion, began to act more independently. What was once a colony began to look suspiciously like a kingdom again. And this is where the long game paid off. Over the centuries, Egypt had taught the Nubians how to rule like pharaohs. They taught them how to write inscriptions, how to worship the gods in formal temple ceremonies, how to build monumental architecture, and how to organize a state from the top down. And the Nubians, to their eternal credit, learned. But they also remembered. They remembered their past, their lands, and their own power. So when Egypt finally blinked, when its bureaucrats packed up their scrolls and went home, when the temples fell silent and the gold shipments ceased, Nubia did not collapse. It coalesced, it waited, and then it began to reclaim what it had always quietly considered its own. Within a few generations, those very temples at Jebel Barkal would be filled again, not with Egyptian priests, but with Nubian kings and queens. The descendants of farmers, archers, and herders would step into the very institutions built to govern them and declare, without irony or hesitation, that they were now the rightful rulers of Egypt. And as it turned out, they would be correct. Sometime in the 9th century BCE, as the last Egyptian garrisons withdrew,
and the ceremonial temples at Nubian sites like Soleb and Amara began to fill with dust and birdsong. Something subtle yet extraordinary happened. The Nubians didn't just revert to the way things were before the Egyptians came. They did something more interesting. They reimagined their future by sifting through the ruins of their past. And at the center of this transformation was a place called Napata, a modest but sacred settlement nestled against a flat-topped mountain that jutted out of the desert like a broken tooth. This was Jebel Barkal, a sandstone outcrop so strange and imposing to behold that both Egyptians and Nubians believed it was the earthly home of the gods. It is hard to overstate the symbolic power of this mountain. The Egyptians, during their colonial centuries, had built a sprawling temple of Amun at its base, complete with all the colonnades, offering halls, and priests trained in all the theological intricacies of the Theban creed. They believed Jebel Barkal was where Amun manifested himself in the south, a kind of spiritual annex to Karnak, and they treated it with reverence. But when they left, they bequeathed more than stone and abandoned rituals. They left behind the foundations of a state religion, the tools of divine kingship, and a space that could be reclaimed not just physically, but ideologically. And that is exactly what the Nubians did. Napata essentially started as a religious capital, but out of religion came politics, and out of politics came power. The early kings of this new phase of Nubian history, most notably King Alara, whose name figures in inscriptions as a cross between a founding father and a semi-divine ancestor, understood that sovereignty could no longer come only from cattle wealth. Times had changed. The Nile Valley was no longer a patchwork of chieftains and herdsmen. It was a place of temples, bloodlines, and divine sanction. The Nubians had lived under that system long enough to see how it worked, so they claimed it. Alara's successors, notably Kashta and Payi, and those who would follow, took the forms of Egyptian statehood and reforged them into something uniquely Kushite. They would write their names in hieroglyphs. They would build pyramids. They would crown themselves with the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, exactly as the pharaohs had done. But they would do all of this in the name of a Nubian kingdom, centered on Nubian land and shaped by Nubian priorities. The kings of Napata were not yet claiming Egypt itself, but they began to position themselves as its spiritual heirs. When Kashta moved north and intervened in the politics of Thebes, then a semi-independent city clinging to old religious traditions, he did so not as a conqueror, but as a patron. He supported the priesthood of Amun, made donations to the temples, and orchestrated the appointment of his daughter to the office of God's wife of Amun, a role that carried enormous religious and political clout in Upper Egypt. It was an elegant move, part diplomatic and part pious, and it signaled to both Nubians and Egyptians that the center of power was shifting. Egypt might still cling to its own kings, but the real authority, the divine endorsement, was drifting south. Back in Napata, the Kingdom of Kush was taking shape not through bombastic declarations of empire, but through the more patient, deliberate language of religious legitimacy and dynastic succession. The early Kushite kings cautiously positioned themselves not as upstarts, but as restorers of the divine order. After all, they were the last rulers in the Nile Valley who were still performing the full rites of Amun. Their temples were well maintained, their priests well funded, and their courts were surrounded by advisors who understood both Egyptian and Nubian customs. And, most importantly, their people believed in them. In the villages and cattle camps along the Nile, the name of the king in Napata carried real weight. It meant justice, prosperity, and protection.
It meant the gods had not forgotten Nubia. The archaeological evidence from this period supports the image of a growing, confident state. At the royal necropolis of El Kuru, situated near Jebel Barkal, the earliest pyramids began to rise, not in the Giza style, vast, horizontal, and mathematically sublime, but smaller, steeper, and more intimate. These were the royal tombs for the kings and queens, built in clusters and surrounded by offering chapels. The inscriptions found there are Egyptian in form, but the content reflects a hybrid culture, a blend of Egyptian theology and Kushite traditions. Some tombs feature painted walls with vivid scenes of the afterlife, including boats sailing the underworld, scenes of divine judgment, and processions of deities. Others contain offerings more typical of older Nubian practices, cattle bones, pottery, and local jewelry that would have felt right at home in the Kermakara. And then there is the matter of language. The Kushites were still using Egyptian hieroglyphs for their formal inscriptions at this time, but the spoken language of the court was likely a form of early Meroitic or another Nubian language, suggesting a society that was multilingual, bicultural, and strategically adaptive. In many ways, this ability to operate fluidly across multiple cultural codes was Kush's greatest strength. It allowed them to speak the language of empire without forgetting their roots. It allowed them to rule Thebes and Napata with equal confidence, and it set the stage for what was to come next, a bold and unprecedented move that would change the balance of power in the ancient world. Because just over the horizon, in the divided kingdoms of Egypt, the pharaohs were stumbling. Civil war and fragmentation had left the Nile fragmented, with rival claimants, local warlords, and ineffectual kings scrambling for control. The Kushite kings watched this from their palaces in Napata, listened to the reports from the north, and waited. They had the temples, they had the gold, they had the favor of Amun, and perhaps most crucially, they had time. No one in Egypt was thinking about the Nubians anymore. They were politely forgotten as former vassals, as cattle herders in pyramids, as once exotic allies of a now irrelevant past. There was something deeply satisfying about a people who waited patiently while the great cities of Egypt burned through dynasties, assassinations, civil wars, and the slow erosion of divine authority. The Kushites waited not in idleness, but in quiet, deliberate motion. They built their pyramids, maintained their temples, trained their scribes, and grew their strength in the folds of the river and the sanctuary of the hills. They did not announce their return to history with trumpets or invasions. They let Egypt, in its shaky disorder, open the door for them. The moment arrived in the 8th century BCE, a time when Egypt was shattered into a patchwork of city-states and rival dynasts, each proclaiming himself pharaoh, but lacking the resources to govern more than a few provinces at a time. The north was ruled by kings of Libyan descent, who had intermarried with the Egyptian elite and inherited thrones more by convenience than conviction. The south, meanwhile, was centered around Thebes, still sacred in name, but weakened by debt and political confusion. Into this landscape stepped the Kushite king Kashta, who entered Egypt not with banners and drums, but with diplomacy and surprising political grace. He understood that Egypt, for all its chaos, still valued its gods, and nowhere were the gods more revered than in Thebes, where the cult of Amun still held sway. By aligning himself with this priesthood, Kashta bypassed the secular rulers and went straight to the heart of Egypt's spiritual legitimacy. His most brilliant move was sending his daughter, Amenirtis, to be installed as the god's wife of Amun, a title that was religious in theory but held immense political power in practice. It had evolved into a kind of female priestly royalty, and by placing his daughter in this role, Kashta did not just symbolically enter the Egyptian state, he occupied it. Thebes did not resist. In fact, they accepted the move with a kind of relieved resignation, as if someone who remembered how things were supposed to work had finally arrived. In doing so,
Kashta laid the foundation for complete political control. His successors would not need to break Egypt, they would merely need to inherit it. That inheritance fell to Pi, or Pionk, who ruled Kush from Napata, took what his father started and elevated it to something extraordinary. Pi is one of the most fascinating rulers in ancient history, not because of his military victories, though they were impressive, but because of the tone in which he described them. He left behind a detailed inscription, the Victory Stela, that recounts his campaign into Egypt around 730 BCE, a period when the northern rulers were again fighting among themselves and making a terrible mess of governance. Pi, alarmed by the disorder, and perhaps a little offended that people were mismanaging land he considered sacred, decided to intervene. The stela reads like a mix between a sermon and a military diary. Pi, who saw himself as the rightful champion of Mat, the Egyptian principle of order, truth, and justice, framed his campaign as a holy mission. He did not just invade Egypt, he cleansed it. His forces methodically advanced north, accepting the surrender of one city after another. When he arrived at Memphis, one of the most vital capitals of ancient Egypt, he besieged it, took it by force, and then lectured the local rulers, not for their rebellion, but for neglecting to properly care for their horses. This detail is genuine. In his inscription, Pi berates the princes of Egypt for poorly feeding their horses, a crime that in his eyes made them unfit for leadership. It is at once absurd and profoundly telling. Pi saw himself not just as a conqueror, but a reformer, restoring a sacred tradition that had been stained by lazy caretakers. But Pi did not stay in Egypt. Having accepted the submission of the rival kings and restored the temples of Amun, he returned to Napata. He had made his point. He was the ruler of Egypt. Whether he wore the crown in Memphis or not, his successors would complete the task of political consolidation. But the symbolic conquest had already been achieved. Egypt was no longer the center of power. That center now lay several hundred miles south, at the foot of a mountain that the Egyptians had once claimed, but that now belonged to a people who had never truly let it go. The reign of Paye marks the formal beginning of what historians call the 25th dynasty of Egypt, often dubbed the Dynasty of the Black Pharaohs, a term which, while benevolent in its celebration of African identity, sometimes obscures the fact that these rulers were not newcomers to the Nile Valley. They were a continuation of a tradition that stretched back to Kerma and even earlier. The astonishing thing isn't that they came from Nubia, but that it took them so long to return. When they did not present themselves as foreign conquerors. They styled themselves as restorers, preservers of the old ways, champions of Amun, and inheritors of the moral and spiritual duties of kingship. In Napata, the court flourished, temples were expanded, royal tombs multiplied, and craftsmen carved statues with serene expressions and colossal shoulders. The intellectual and artistic world of Egypt was not lost in this transition. It was revived in a new setting, refreshed by Kushite perspective and guided by Kushite priorities. And yet the kings remained deeply Egyptian in form. They used hieroglyphs, they wore the double crown, they commissioned Egyptian-style temples. It was a fusion, not a replacement. A civilization built on memory, dignity, and quiet resilience had finally stepped into the light with a crown that had always, in a sense, been its own. So the Nubians, who had been subjects, allies, enemies, and secondary figures, were now the sovereigns. They had waited patiently, watched carefully, and learned deeply. And when the moment came, they didn't just seize power, they embodied it. If ancient Egypt was to have one last glorious century, it began not in Thebes or Memphis, or even the sun-drenched courts of Karnak. It began in Napata, a place that seemed almost off the map to most Egyptians, a land of unfamiliar speech, darker skin, and distant gods
who, strangely, wore the same crowns as their own. Yet by the late 8th century BCE, it was from this southern capital that Egypt was not only governed, but revitalized under a dynasty of kings who saw themselves not as foreign invaders, but as the spiritual keepers of all that Egypt once stood for. These were the kings of Kush, the so-called Black Pharaohs, and their story is one of the most compelling turnabouts in the ancient world. It began in earnest with Paye, the same ruler who reprimanded Egyptian princes for neglecting their horses, and then politely demanded their fealty. His campaign, waged around 730 BCE, was not a conquest in the usual sense. In his mind, it was a kind of ritual purification. Egypt, broken into squabbling principalities and petty kingdoms, had lost its soul. The great temples were neglected. The gods were poorly attended to. The pharaohs were no longer god-kings, but local warlords with delusions of grandeur. Paye, the Nubian king of cattle, temples, and ancient piety, believed he was chosen by Amun himself to set things right. And remarkably, nobody could stop him. Moving north with a disciplined army that included the famed Nubian archers, Paye advanced through Middle and Upper Egypt like a breeze through a withered vineyard. City after city surrendered, not only out of fear, but because he seemed to offer something that had long been missing: order, purpose, meaning. His inscription, found on a triumphant stela, tells the story with all the serene confidence of a man who believes history is patiently awaiting his arrival. He defeats one city, then another. Rulers bow down, priests nod approvingly. At Memphis, he stages a siege so swift and effective that the local king barely has time to get dressed before surrendering. Paye then enters the sacred temples, makes offerings to the gods, and proclaims the renewal of the divine order. And then, just as suddenly, he leaves. It's one of the strangest parts of the story. Instead, he collected oaths of loyalty, made sure the temples were functioning again, and then sailed south to his own capital, leaving behind hand-picked allies and relatives to maintain order. It is a move that baffles modern historians and would have driven any ancient Egyptian courtier mad. But it tells you something about Paye. He was not a usurper, not a power-hungry general. He was a man who believed in the idea of Egypt, not the comfort of its thrones. His successors, however, were more pragmatic. Following Paye, the next major figure is his brother, Shabaka, who understood that symbolism wasn't enough. Shabaka marched north and formally occupied the Egyptian throne. He revived royal monuments, restored temples, and compiled theological texts. Most famously, the Memphite theology, an inscription that preserved ancient beliefs, was likely put together under him, perhaps helping to stitch together a national history that was fraying. Under Shabaka, Egypt wasn't just stable, it was confident. Kushite control brought a kind of moral authority the country hadn't seen in generations. Even the art and sculpture of the period reflected this. 25th Dynasty statues portray the kings with rounded cheeks, full lips, and tightly curled hair, features that clearly reflected their Nubian identity and were depicted not with shame, but with pride. These statues stood in the temples next to those of Ramesses and Thutmose, silently but firmly declaring, "We too are pharaohs."
But ruling Egypt was never simple, even at the best of times. While the Kushite kings tried to maintain a delicate balance of reverence and reform, the world was changing around them. To the northeast, the Assyrian Empire was expanding like a wildfire, consuming cities and kingdoms from Mesopotamia to the Levant. The Assyrians were not subtle. Their kings carved reliefs showing captives flayed alive, cities impaled, and entire populations relocated. They were efficient, terrifying, and utterly uninterested in diplomacy. The Nubian dynasty's presence in Egypt was viewed by Assyria not as a curiosity, but as a threat. The stage was set for a confrontation that would pit the old order of Egypt, now housed in Napatan temples and Nubian pyramids, against the most formidable war machine the world had ever seen. But before the first spear was thrown, before the first chariot wheel rolled over the delta sands, the Kushite dynasty had already achieved something extraordinary. It reversed the flow of empire. It took the cultural and religious symbols that had once been used to dominate Nubia and turned them into tools of revival. It showed that Egypt did not belong to one land or one people. It belonged to anyone willing to carry its burdens, serve its gods, and humbly enter its temples, knowing that every stone held a memory. For nearly a century, the kings of Kush ruled both Nubia and Egypt as a single realm. Their capital was at Napata, but their hearts spanned the entire Nile. Yes, they were the Black Pharaohs, but they were more than that. They were Egyptian pharaohs in the deepest and most sincere sense, and they made the old land sing again, if only for a brief time. If Paye was the visionary and Shabaka the restorer, then Taharqa was the builder, the dreamer, the chief workhorse of the empire. When he ascended the throne around 690 BCE, Egypt was not just a crown on his head, it was a storm cloud on the horizon. To rule Egypt and Nubia together was a triumph, yes, but it also meant inheriting centuries of problems, enemies, and restless provinces tired of changing loyalties and occasional foreign meddling. Taharqa stepped into this chaos not with hesitation, but with immense confidence, the kind that comes from both divine conviction and an imperial to-do list so long it would make any mortal pause. He was, quite simply, one of the most dynamic rulers the Nile had seen in centuries. He commissioned massive building projects all along the river, especially at Karnak and Jebel Barkal, where he expanded temples, added pylons, and restored rituals that had long fallen into disuse. At Kawa, a town near modern Dongola in Sudan, he built an elegant temple of Amun that partially survives today, with sandstone columns carved in exquisite detail. The inscriptions he left behind don't just boast of his victories or piety. They tell stories of taming floods, gathering harvests of grain, placating the gods, and ensuring the temple columns didn't lean. But for all his domestic achievements, one overriding concern dominated Taharqa's reign: Assyria. The Assyrian Empire, under kings like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, was rapidly growing and had a particularly irritating habit of meddling in Egyptian affairs. Assyria, unlike the old empires, did not conquer slowly or politely. It arrived with armies of terrifying discipline, siege engines the size of buildings, and scribes who meticulously recorded every beheading, flaying, and deportation for future generations. In Egypt, the presence of the Nubian dynasty was viewed by Assyria not as a curiosity, but as a threat. Taharqa was the man who stood in the way when Assyria decided Egypt should be part of its growing portfolio of subjugated kingdoms. At first, he held them off. In 701 BCE, during a campaign in the Levant, Taharqa may have played a role, still debated but intriguing, in aiding the kingdom of Judah against an Assyrian siege. The Bible, no stranger to grand narratives, even mentions him by name in the book of Isaiah, calling him the king of Ethiopia who came out against Sennacherib, the then Assyrian monarch. It's a brief and murky episode, but it suggests that Taharqa's influence stretched far beyond the Nile. He wasn't just defending Egypt, he was asserting himself on the international stage as part of a network of resistance against the Assyrian tide. But the tide, as tides often do, rose in 674 BCE. Esarhaddon, the son of Sennacherib, harboring no love for Kushite power, launched a full-scale invasion of Egypt.
Taharqa repulsed the first attempt, which the Assyrians dutifully blamed on bad omens, rain, or perhaps the incompetence of a few unnamed generals. But the second attempt in 671 BCE was a success. The Assyrian army swept through the Nile Delta, captured Memphis, and forced Taharqa to retreat south. It was a painful moment. His capital was desecrated, his legitimacy challenged, and his enemies were trumpeting their great victory back in Nineveh. Assyrian reliefs from this campaign show Egyptian and Nubian captives being dragged by their beards, hands tied behind their backs, solemnly led before the stone-eyed kings. But Taharqa was not broken. In one of those moments that reveal the steel behind the sandstone, he regrouped, gathered his forces in Upper Egypt and Nubia, and came back. By 669 BCE, he had managed to retake Thebes and push north again, sending the Assyrians scrambling. This tug-of-war went on for years, with cities changing hands, governors switching allegiances, and temples caught in the crossfire. In the end, however, the Assyrians responded with overwhelming force. They installed local vassals in the delta, most notably Psamtik I, a Libyan Egyptian prince, who would go on to found the 26th dynasty and effectively push Kushite power out of Egypt for good.
Taharqa retreated to Nubia once more. His dreams of a united Nile were broken, but not forgotten. He died in 664 BCE, not in dishonor, but in a kind of stubborn grandeur. His reign did not end in triumph, but neither did it collapse. His tomb at Nuri, right across the river from Napata, is one of the largest pyramids in Nubia, standing as a quiet, sun-baked monument to a man who ruled two kingdoms, faced the cruelest empire in the world, and left behind a legacy that resonates still. Under his rule, Egypt saw its last great artistic revival. Temples flourished, the image of the king regained its authority, and the idea that Nubia could be Egypt, not just a shadow, but a mirror, and at times a better one, was carved into stone. The dynasty did not end with him, but the writing on the wall was evident. His successor, Tantamani, made one final bold attempt to reclaim Egypt, but was defeated at Memphis by the Assyrians and their allies in the delta. The Kushite kings would henceforth rule only in Nubia, where they would remain powerful, devout, and proud. They would continue to build temples, erect pyramids, and honor Amun long after the rest of Egypt had moved on to new gods and new conquerors. Their history wasn't over, but their time on the Egyptian throne was. Nevertheless, what they achieved was remarkable. They took a kingdom dismissed as peripheral, a people written out of the center of history, and showed that greatness could flow both ways along the Nile. The Black Pharaohs did not just rule Egypt, they reminded Egypt of what it could be, and in doing so, they took a place in the ancient world not as imitators, but as the architects of their own destiny. If you had stood on the steps of a temple in Napata in the mid-7th century BCE and looked north, the view would have been one of melancholy splendor. The Nile, gleaming and slow, would have carried as many memories as water. Memories of golden victories in Thebes, of rituals performed beneath the columns of Karnak, of kings from Nubia sitting on the throne of Horus. But that time was ending. The kings of Kush were driven out of Egypt by the iron will and sharper swords of the Assyrians and their allies in the delta. The city of Memphis, once captured and recaptured by Taharqa, now belonged to men who owed their crowns to foreign generals and Babylonian scribes. Thebes, the spiritual heart of Upper Egypt, had been stripped of its treasures and punished for its loyalty to Nubia. The dream of a united Nile, once so vivid in the hands of Piye and Taharqa, was drifting away like mist on the river. But if the kings of Kush felt defeat, they did not show it. They did not collapse into nothingness, nor did they retreat into myth. Instead, they looked south, to a land older than the dynasties and richer than many remembered. This was Meroë,
a region situated between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile, where the river bends into grassy savannas and thorny forests, and the landscape changes from Egyptian stone to sub-Saharan earth. Meroë had always been part of the Nubian heartland, but now it was ready to become something more. What the kings of Kush had once borrowed and blended with Egyptian grandeur, they were now ready to reimagine. The move to Meroë was not immediate, nor was it publicly announced. It happened slowly, like a family quietly changing homes in the night. Napata remained the ceremonial capital, the place where kings were still crowned beneath the sacred rocks of Jebel Barkal, and offerings were made to Amun, the god who had guided them in their imperial days. But over time, the center of political gravity shifted south. The reasons for this were compelling. The land around Meroë was more fertile, with greater rainfall and richer grazing. The region supported cattle, sorghum, millet, and even cotton, a crop that hadn't taken hold further north. The nearby hills abounded with iron ore, a resource that would define the future of Nubian industry. And perhaps most importantly, Meroë was far enough from Egypt to be safe.
What emerged at Meroë was something the Nile Valley had never seen before. It was no longer quite Egypt, even though its kings still honored Egyptian gods and built pyramids in the old style. And it wasn't quite sub-Saharan Africa, even though the rhythms of the land and the faces of the people were undeniably shaped by it. It was a fusion, yet not an imitation. The Meroitic kingdom took the accumulated heritage of Kerma and Napata and added to it a new sense of autonomy, creativity, and regional pride. If the rulers of Napata had defined themselves through their relationship with Egypt, the rulers of Meroë now looked inward. They built cities of red brick and stone. They created their own writing system, and they developed industries that no longer depended on trade with the north. They were no longer pharaohs in exile. They were something else entirely, something utterly Nubian. The architecture tells part of this story. The pyramids of Meroë, built in neat clusters on windswept ridges, are smaller and steeper than those of Giza or Saqqara. They rise like stone needles from the desert floor. Each is capped with a narrow tip and often features a small chapel adorned with reliefs that blend Egyptian iconography with distinctly local features. There are images of kings smiting enemies, yes, but also of lions, giraffes, and ibexes, creatures of the Nubian world, not the Nile Delta. Some gods take familiar shapes. Amun still appears, as does Isis, but other deities are uniquely Meroitic. Apetimak, the lion-headed god of war, becomes prominent during this period. He is not an Egyptian transplant. He is indigenous, fierce, and protective, and his temples would one day rival those of any god in the ancient world. The Meroitic kingdom also began to linguistically separate itself from Egypt. By about 300 BCE, the Nubians had developed their own alphabet, now known as Meroitic, comprising separate cursive and hieroglyphic versions. To this day, the Meroitic language remains only partially deciphered, a tantalizing reminder that we still know far less about this civilization than we should. Inscriptions are found on stelae, temple walls, and funerary objects. They speak of kings and queens, conquests and dedications, but much of their meaning is still locked within the curls and scratches of a language no one now speaks. That in itself is telling. The Meroites had something to say, but they were no longer interested in saying it in Egyptian. All of this, the temples, the pyramids, the writing, the shift, was done not with a fanfare of trumpets, but with a kind of quiet authority. Meroë didn't burst onto the scene. It grew, it matured, and it endured. For centuries, it would stand as one of the most stable and prosperous kingdoms in Africa, renowned for its iron production, its long-distance trade,
and its extraordinary tolerance for powerful queens who would one day go to war and challenge emperors. This was a civilization born not in conquest, but in resilience, a testament to a people who, having lost their place in one empire, set about building another, entirely on their own terms. The story of Meroë is not a story of retreat, it is a story of a turn. The kings of Kush did not vanish when they left Egypt, they reinvented themselves. They moved south not to hide, but to begin again. And in doing so, they created a civilization that would flourish for nearly 1,000 years, long after the temples of Thebes had crumbled and the name of Taharqa had faded from the memory of the Nile. It is strange and humbling to consider that one of the great industrial cities of the ancient world once stood not in Rome, Athens, or Nineveh, but on a grassy stretch of the Upper Nile, where elephants grazed in the distance and giraffes watched travelers behind acacia trees. That city was Meroë, and by the 1st centuries BCE, it had become something extraordinary, a hub of royal power, religious life, and perhaps most surprisingly of all, iron smelting on a scale that wouldn't be matched in the region for over a millennium. The skyline of Meroë, if one can apply such a word to a city of temples and smokestacks, must have been an impressive sight. There were pyramids, of course, and colonnades of palaces, but there were also vast fields of black slag, mounds of charcoal, ash, and iron waste left over from countless smelting fires, now solidified into hills beneath the sun. This was not a minor side industry, it was the economic engine of the Meroitic kingdom. The Meroitic people had discovered, perhaps centuries earlier, that the iron-rich hills to the east of the city could be mined and processed into tools, weapons, jewelry, and trade goods. Combined with the abundant supply of hard wood from the surrounding savannas, used to create the charcoal necessary for the high-temperature furnaces, Meroë became a kind of Iron Age metropolis. Travelers entering the city would smell the acrid fumes of the burning fuel, hear the rhythmic clang of the smith's hammers, and see caravans setting off with goods headed for all corners of Africa and the Mediterranean. It was the Birmingham of the ancient Sudanese world. The presence of iron changed everything. Iron tools allowed for more intensive agriculture, which in turn supported a larger population. Iron weapons gave the kingdom a military advantage over neighboring groups who still relied on bronze or stone. And iron products became commodities of trade that reached far-flung networks to Egypt, the Red Sea ports, and, as some believed, even India. Gold and ivory might have brought prestige, but iron paid the bills. The layout of the city reflected this growing prosperity. Archaeological excavations have uncovered extensive residential areas filled with mud brick houses, courtyards, workshops, and public squares. There were administrative buildings where royal scribes recorded tax obligations and priestly decrees. There were temples not only to Amun, who remained revered, though perhaps somewhat softened in meaning, but also to distinctly Meroitic deities, like Aperimak, the lion-headed god of war and fertility, whose temple at Musawarat-es-Sufra remains one of the most enigmatic and magnificent religious complexes in Africa. Its labyrinthian design, courts, and columns suggest it was not just a sanctuary, but a pilgrimage site, a center for ritual and learning, whose purposes may never be fully known. What sets Meroë apart from most of its ancient peers is not just what it built, but how it governed. While the kings remained central to the state's identity, Meroë was notable for the remarkable visibility and authority of its royal women. Queens, queen mothers, and regents, known by the title Kandake or Candace, played active and often dominant roles in both religious and political life. They appear in inscriptions standing next to kings, issuing decrees, and in some cases leading armies into battle. One Kandake, in particular, would one day go face to face with the Roman Empire, but that chapter is for later.
For now, it is enough to note that the Meroitic state did not simply tolerate powerful women, it expected them. Mummification became less common, though it didn't disappear entirely. Burial customs changed. Instead of sprawling flat tombs or pyramidal complexes with intricate internal chambers, the Meroic elite were interred beneath steep-sided pyramids, often accompanied by offerings that mixed Egyptian, Nubian, and local forms. Their own script also emerged, the Meroic alphabet, now appearing with regularity on stelae and temple walls, was a bold statement of cultural independence. To this day, the Meroic language remains only partially deciphered. It tantalizes historians with its elegant lines and stubborn silence. We can read names, titles, and dates, but the full grammar and vocabulary remain a mystery. It is one of the last great uncracked alphabets of the ancient world, a reminder that for all we think we know, Meroë still guards its secrets. The Meroic state was also remarkably long-lived. While Egypt endured frequent invasions and the Mediterranean world descended into a whirl of Hellenistic wars and Roman bureaucracy, Meroë continued to evolve. It outlasted the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and even the Ptolemies. It developed a political structure strong enough to manage trade, religion, and agriculture over hundreds of miles, yet flexible enough to adapt to regional shifts and innovations. Its iron furnaces never stopped burning. Its pyramids kept rising. Its queens still issued commands that shifted the course of armies. In short, it was everything a civilization ought to be: sophisticated, resilient, inventive, and quietly magnificent. And yet, for all the success, Meroë remained curiously outside the great narratives of antiquity. It did not seek to conquer Rome or challenge Greece. It left behind no great philosophical treatises or epics carved in marble. It simply endured. It flourished. It created. And it left behind ruins that even today, surrounded by the shifting sands of northern Sudan, feel less like the remains of a dead empire and more like the bones of something still alive, patient, waiting, and proud. By the time most people in the ancient world heard of Meroë, it was already old. This was not unusual. Great cities often make their first impression on outsiders long after they have come to terms with themselves. Rome was a muddy trading post long before it became mistress of the Mediterranean. Athens existed for centuries before anyone thought to build the Parthenon. Such was the case with Meroë. By the time curious Greek historians and Roman generals began recording accounts of a mysterious black land beyond Egypt, populated by tall people, ruled by warrior queens, and filled with strangely steep pyramids, the city had been building, smelting, worshipping, and ruling for generations. What they stumbled upon was not a rising star, but a fully mature kingdom, a kingdom of iron and gold, of fire and stone, with customs as rich and layered as the black silt along its riverbanks. The city itself was laid out with a kind of quiet confidence. Meroë made no attempt to mirror the rigid city planning of Greco-Roman colonies or the axial alignment of Egyptian ceremonial capitals. Meroë grew organically out from the banks of the Nile, climbing onto low ridges and descending into industrial quarters where the air was thick with smoke and the ground littered with iron slag. And this is not a metaphor. Vast fields of smelting waste still surround the archaeological site, hundreds of thousands of tons of it, piled higher than a person in some spots. It is the physical remnant of a city that worked, that forged its identity not through marble or myth, but through labor. Yet Meroë was never a grim factory town. The royal quarters, with their painted walls and columned halls, reveal a court life filled with luxury and ceremony. Goldsmiths produced exquisite jewelry, neck rings, bracelets, and earrings shaped like lotus blossoms or stylized lions, while sculptors carved kings and gods from sandstone. Their faces were round and serene, often with slightly smiling mouths and eyes half closed in a state of eternal awareness. The craftsmen no longer merely copied Egyptian models. The style had evolved, softened, and become something uniquely Meroitic, a style born from the sandstone, the sun, and the memory of distant ancestors. At the nearby pyramids, the chapels were filled with scenes of offerings and rituals, but one could also find lions, giraffes, and fantastic beasts carved alongside the more traditional falcons and cobras. The kingdom had become confident enough in its own stories to freely add to them. Economically, Meroë was a marvel of sustainability and trade. Its wealth rested on three pillars: iron, which it produced in huge quantities, gold, which it mined and exported with practiced ease, and trade, which flowed in all directions. The Nile connected it to Egypt and the Mediterranean. Overland routes connected it to sub-Saharan Africa, to the frankincense-growing regions of Arabia, and even through a complex network of middlemen to the ports of India. Goods from India have been found in Nubian tombs, suggesting that someone, somewhere, was moving objects from one end of the known world to the other. Meroë was also mentioned in the writings of Strabo and Pliny, Roman scholars, who described it in terms that were both respectful and confused. To them, it was a distant kingdom of curious customs and formidable queens, a place at once threatening and admirable. One of Meroë's most striking features at its peak is its ability to project power without projecting arrogance. Unlike the Assyrians, who carved their conquests in endless bas-reliefs of screaming captives, or the Romans, who couldn't leave a city alone for more than a generation, the Meroitic kingdom does not seem to have been built on conquest alone. It certainly had a strong military. Its kings and queens were not shy about defending their borders, but its longevity was founded more on cultural cohesion, economic resilience, and religious legitimacy than on brute force. In an era when empires crumbled under the weight of their own ambition, Meroë endured with the quiet stubbornness of a well-built furnace. Religion remained central to this identity, but it too changed. Amun, once the great god of Thebes and Napata, remained important, but he was joined, and in some places eclipsed, by indigenous deities. Epidemic, the lion-headed god of war, became a figure of royal power. His temples were richly decorated, and his role was tied to kingship and victory. His iconography was wholly local. He was a creature of Nubia, and his emergence reflected a growing sense that Meroë was no longer merely preserving Egyptian traditions, it was creating its own. Perhaps the greatest symbol of this autonomy was the Meroitic script, which by this point had become the official writing system of the court and religious life. Hieroglyphs were still used in sacred contexts, but for laws, trade documents, and royal decrees, Meroitic was the language of record. It was a striking departure from centuries of Egyptian dominance, and even though it remains largely undeciphered, its very presence tells us that the people of Meroë were inscribing themselves into history with a voice no longer borrowed from another civilization. What is most striking about the golden age of Meroë is not that it happened, but that so few people today know that it did. This was a city where queens ruled armies, where smiths were as important as priests, where pyramids rose not to challenge Giza, but to stand beside it as equals. Meroë, at its peak, was not the shadow of Egypt. It was its successor, not by bloodline, but by survival. And in many ways, it surpassed its predecessor. Egypt had the grandeur, Meroë had the stamina, and in the long, slow arc of time, it was arguably the more impressive of the two. If there was one thing that distinguished Meroë from almost every other kingdom in the ancient world, it was the visibility and authority of its royal women. While Egypt certainly produced its share of powerful queens, Hatshepsut and Cleopatra being the most famous, these women were exceptions to the rule. In Meroë, royal women were part of the rulebook. The Kandakes, often translated as Queen Mother, but better understood as a ruling queen or empress, was not a ceremonial title. It was a position of power, woven into the political and religious DNA of the kingdom. A Kandake could co-rule with her son, rule alone, or lead armies. She could commission temples, issue decrees, and appear on coinage holding weapons or seated on thrones. Greek and Roman historians were puzzled. Their accounts of Meroë often included references to formidable black queens who were unafraid of generals and humbled emperors. One of the most famous of these was Amanirenas, a Kandake who reigned in the late 1st century BCE and would leave her mark in such a way that her name would echo from the temples of Nubia to the marble columns of Rome. In 25 BCE, just a few years after Rome annexed Egypt, Amanirenas launched a military campaign north into Roman territory, attacking garrisons at Elephantine and Aswan. According to Roman sources, her forces sacked Roman temples, destroyed imperial statues, and even captured a bronze head of Emperor Augustus, which she then ceremonially buried beneath the temple's steps so her people could literally tread on Rome. The Roman counterattack came swiftly. The governor of Egypt, Gaius Petronius, led a retaliatory campaign, but the Meroites refused to yield. Amanirenas and her forces regrouped, wore down the Romans with hit-and-run tactics, and eventually negotiated a peace treaty that was surprisingly favorable to Meroë. Rome agreed to withdraw from southern Egypt and set a permanent boundary well north of Meroitic lands. Meroë was exempted from paying tribute. The encounter with Rome was a moment of international visibility for a kingdom that had long been underestimated. Meroë's influence stretched far beyond military skirmishes. It was also a commercial hub, plugged into trade routes that spanned the Red Sea, reached Central Africa, and possibly the Indian Ocean. Archaeological finds include items from distant regions: Indian beads, Roman glass, Arabian frankincense, and sub-Saharan ivory. Meroë likely acted as both producer and intermediary, making it not just wealthy, but cosmopolitan. And yet, for all this outward success, signs of strain were beginning to appear. The forests that had once supplied the iron industry were thinning. The demand for charcoal led to deforestation, which in turn impacted agriculture. The trade routes that had once brought prosperity began to shift, as sea lanes became more reliable and overland caravans more perilous. Slowly, the currents of global commerce moved away from the Nile corridor, and Meroë began to feel more remote. But during the centuries surrounding the turn of the Common Era, Meroë stood at its peak of glory. It had evolved from a displaced court into a self-sufficient capital, from a kingdom in exile into a civilization entitled to its existence. It ruled through queens and kings, through iron and faith, and it did so with a confidence that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. In a world dominated by the bombast of empire, Meroë left behind something far more powerful than conquest. It left behind continuity, and that is ultimately what makes it so impressive. While empires crumbled, while gods rose and fell, while languages changed and cities burned, Meroë endured. It smelted, it sang, and it prayed for over 1,000 years. And if it sometimes did so quietly, that only makes its history the more remarkable. By the time the Mediterranean world began drawing maps that included Meroë, the city was already a veteran of time. Its pyramids clustered in neat rows behind the eastern walls, its temples pulsed with centuries of prayer, and its queens, those formidable women known as the Kandake, ruled not as exceptions, but as the norm. The Greeks and Romans, accustomed to dynasties where power was politely handed down between sons, found the situation confounding. Herodotus and Strabo could write all day about pharaohs and satraps, but they had no ready vocabulary for a kingdom in which a woman could wear the crown, direct armies, and receive ambassadors at court with the full authority of a king. So they mythologized. The Kandake, more accurately Kandi in their language, became, in the Greco-Roman imagination, tall warrior queens. They were often imagined as above-average height, incredibly wise, unshakable in battle, and sometimes surrounded by elephants. This was not entirely untrue. Meroë's rulers were taller than many Mediterranean peoples, thanks in part to diet and genetics. They did command elephants, not only for ivory, but as war beasts, and they were certainly wise, especially concerning diplomacy, regional control, and long-term survival. But there was something about a reigning black queen from the depths of Africa that elicited both admiration and fear in the classical imagination. For the ancient West, Meroë was both exotic and worthy, a land that seemed to exist outside the usual bounds of empire, somehow resistant to the pattern of conquest and collapse that plagued so many others. The most famous of these queens was Amani-Renas, whose name now rightly stands among the great rulers of antiquity. When she came to power in the last decades of the 1st century BCE, Rome was still young as an empire, but fiercely expansionistic. Egypt, newly absorbed by the Romans after the awkward and fatal romance of Cleopatra and Antony, was supposed to serve as a stable southern frontier, a grain basket, and a quiet province. But Rome miscalculated. It assumed Egypt marked the end of the world. It didn't factor in Meroë just beyond the cataracts, and it certainly didn't factor in Amani-Renas, whose rule would redefine that border with blood and bronze. When Roman forces extended their control past Thebes, establishing garrisons at Aswan and sending tax collectors into territory long claimed by Kush, Amani-Renas responded not with negotiation, but with invasion. Her forces moved swiftly, seizing the southern Egyptian outposts, looting Roman statues, and, most memorably, decapitating a bronze likeness of Augustus and dragging it home as a trophy. This was not symbolic violence. It was theater, politics, and revenge all rolled into one. The head was buried beneath the temple's threshold, so that every time a Meroitic worshipper entered the sacred space, they could do so by literally walking on the face of Rome. Rome responded, as it always did, with overwhelming force. The Roman governor Petronius marched south, sacked Napata, and attempted to install puppet rulers in the region. But Amani-Renas, blinded in one eye from a battle injury, and reportedly undeterred by setbacks, rallied her forces. What followed was a series of skirmishes and campaigns that ultimately exhausted both sides. Rome could not hold Nubia, Meroë could not retake Thebes, and so, around 21 BCE, a peace treaty was signed. By Roman standards, it was shockingly generous. The empire agreed to withdraw from the southernmost territories. Meroë was not assessed tribute, and the Kandake remained on her throne undefeated. In Roman terms, it was a stalemate. In Nubian terms, it was a victory. This episode marked more than a military chapter. It established Meroë in the eyes of the Roman world as a power worthy of respect. It was not a curiosity or a client state. It was a sovereign kingdom capable of defending its borders, projecting influence, and negotiating as an equal. And it was led without apology by a woman who stood face to face with one of history's most iconic empires and emerged unscathed. Beyond Rome, Meroë's global footprint was wider than one might imagine today. The city lay at the intersection of several major trade routes, including those running north into Egypt and the Mediterranean, east to the Red Sea ports, and south into Central Africa. Its commodities, ivory, gold, ebony, frankincense, and iron, traveled across deserts and along coastlines, often ending up in the hands of those who would never learn the city's name. In return, Meroë received textiles, spices, pottery, and beads from India, Arabia, and the wider Mediterranean. There is archaeological evidence of Indian glass, Hellenistic amphora,
and Chinese silk passing through Nubian hands. What makes all of this even more impressive is that Meroë, unlike many other kingdoms that flourished through trade, was not dependent on outsiders. It produced most of what it needed, from food to iron to religious legitimacy. Its temples were local, its gods were local, its script was local. The kingdom welcomed contact, but never required it. This independence made it remarkably stable. It could survive shifts in trade winds, the collapse of neighboring empires, and even the occasional Roman invasion without falling apart. It was a civilization built not on the fragile scaffolding of foreign markets, but on self-sufficiency and cultural continuity. As Meroë moved into the 1st century CE, it seemed poised to endure indefinitely. It had lasted for centuries, outliving the Assyrians, the Persians, and the pharaohs themselves. It had outlived the Ptolemies and resisted the Romans. Its queens ruled with confidence and power. Its scribes recorded a language that no one else could read, but everyone around respected. And yet, like all great cities, its time would come. Not with a crash, but slowly, like a furnace cooling after a long burn. The decline of Meroë came quietly, a drought that lasted a little longer than it should, a forest that didn't regrow after the harvest, a caravan that stopped coming because a new sea route made camels obsolete. One of the first problems was ecological, and it came from a source that had once been a strength: iron. The smelting industry that fueled the kingdom's economy required vast amounts of charcoal, which in turn meant a seemingly endless supply of hardwood trees. The acacia forests around Meroë had once been dense and generous, but centuries of industrial fuel production depleted them. With every furnace that was fired, the forest receded a little, and with the trees, the soil also departed. Without roots to hold it, the land eroded. Then there was trade. New trade routes, particularly maritime ones, were gaining strength. The Indian Ocean trade network, supported by better ships and knowledge of seasonal monsoon winds, pulled merchants away from the overland caravan routes. Goods that once had to pass through Nubia were now bypassing the Nile entirely. Ports like Adulis on the Red Sea began to eclipse inland markets, and Meroë, for all its majesty, found itself sidestepped. At the same time, new powers were rising. Chief among them was Aksum, a kingdom located in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Aksum was ambitious, cosmopolitan, and had access to both land and sea. It minted its own coins, adopted Christianity early, and established diplomatic ties with Rome and Byzantium. By the 3rd century CE, it was strong enough to turn its gaze on Meroë, and Meroë, weakened by environmental stress and economic drift, could no longer resist as it once had. According to some sources, the final blow came when the Aksumite king Ezana launched a campaign against Meroë sometime in the 4th century CE. Inscriptions found in the region detail victories over the Nubians and the looting of enemy strongholds. The exact details are debated, but the archaeological evidence aligns with a significant downturn. Temples fell into disuse, trade dwindled, the iron furnaces cooled, and somewhere along the riverbanks, the last Kandake faded from history. Meroë did not vanish entirely. Its monuments stood long after its politics had collapsed. Its pyramids, built on stone platforms and sharply pointed to the sky, continued to catch the sun. The city lay quiet, but it was not forgotten. Travelers still passed by, stories still circulated, and centuries later, European explorers, dusty and awestruck, stumbled upon it and wondered that such a thing could have existed at all. Today, Meroë remains both a mystery and a monument. Its script, still largely uncracked, defies every scholar who dares to believe they can break the code.
Its queens, part legend, part history, continue to inspire books, films, and questions. And its ruins, scattered across the sands of northern Sudan, remind us that civilizations are measured not only by how long they endure, but by what they dared to do while they stood. Meroë dared to be great. It stood for 1,000 years. It ruled without apology. It created its own gods, forged its own culture, and gave the world something it didn't expect: a black kingdom of queens and warriors, of pyramids and prophets, of iron and gold. And though the furnaces are long cool, the story they once fired into the air still smolders, warm and vivid, just beneath the surface of the sand. When Meroë finally fell silent, it did so in a way few great cities manage, without spectacle. There was no Pompeii moment, no final recorded siege. It simply ceased to be what it had been for so long. The iron cooled, the merchants left, the queens disappeared from the stelae. The river flowed on as if nothing had happened. By the time European explorers began their breathless cataloging of African antiquity in the 19th century, Meroë was waiting for them. Not buried under jungle or sealed in volcanic ash, but sitting in plain sight, its pyramids defiantly jutting from the sand, like a multitude of unanswered questions. They were smaller than those at Giza, to be sure, and steeper, with angles that rose like sharp triangles created by eager hands. But they were pyramids nonetheless. Dozens of them clustered in rows on the desert hills, and they were not Egyptian. Not quite. The rediscovery of Meroë was a confusing and romantic affair. In 1822, the Frenchman Frédéric Calliot visited the site and made notes in the way only early European explorers could, part rapture, part imperial condescension. He described the pyramids as beautiful but strange, the reliefs as Egyptian but quaint, and the whole place as being somehow out of time. Later explorers brought sketchbooks and chisels, some shipping back pieces of sculpture and tucking them into museum basements. Others brought dynamite. The Italian adventurer Giuseppe Ferlini, searching for treasure in 1834, blew the tops off nearly 40 pyramids looking for gold, turning centuries of royal tombs into shattered ruins and souvenir fragments. It was a disaster masquerading as archaeology, and its scars are visible to this day. Despite such a crude beginning, the study of Meroë slowly began to take shape. Scholars pieced together the kingdom's chronology from temple inscriptions, shards of pottery, and the occasional record left by Egyptian or Roman scribes. The Meroic script remained elusive, an entire system of writing still only partially understood. It was neither Greek, Coptic, or any known Afro-Asiatic language. It did not yield easily to linguistic investigation. Even today, we know the sounds of its letters, but not always their meanings. A few names emerged, a few phrases, but most of it remains agonizingly silent. The walls are still speaking. We just don't understand the words yet. So, in the absence of complete texts, the story of Meroë was told in fragments, in burial rites and architectural choices, in the arc of its pyramids and the curve of its pottery, in the images of lion-headed gods and crescent-crowned queens, in the iron slag and gold jewelry, in the look of temples that were neither fully Egyptian nor fully African, but something else entirely, a synthesis of traditions that had outgrown its origins. It is a story told through what was left behind, and perhaps more powerfully, through what was not erased. For a long time, the world was content to leave Nubia as a footnote to the greatness of Egypt. School textbooks spoke of pharaohs, pyramids, and the Nile, but the narrative typically stopped at the southern border of modern Egypt, as if the river simply ended there. The Kushites were mentioned, if at all, as invaders who briefly seized the Egyptian throne before fading into obscurity. Meroë went unmentioned. The queens went unmentioned. The The pyramids in Sudan were ignored altogether. It was only in the late 20th century that historians began to seriously re-examine this silence, not just as an oversight, but as an act of historical omission, a kind of forgetting made possible by race, geography, and the inertia of colonial scholarship. What has emerged in recent decades is a much richer and more inclusive portrait of the ancient world. Meroë is now recognized not as a shadow of Egypt, but as a fully fledged and independent civilization. Its queens are studied not as curiosities, but as sovereign rulers with real power. Its economy, once considered peripheral, is now understood as central to the movement of goods across Africa. The story of Meroë matters because it tells us that power, wealth, literacy, and architecture did not belong exclusively to the Mediterranean world. It reminds us that in Black Africa there were cities, there were queens, there were gods, engineers, and astronomers. It reminds us that the idea of civilization is not a gift from the north, but a quilt woven across time and space. And it offers a different kind of historical arc, one that ends not in catastrophe or colonization, but in a kind of dignified withdrawal. Meroë did not burn, it did not fall to rot or plague, it simply receded. It left behind a riddle, a question carved in stone, a city that smelted iron before much of Europe mastered proper agriculture, a kingdom governed by women when the rest of the world was still debating whether women had souls, a script that no one else could read, created not to impress outsiders, but to serve its own people. A place that stood at the intersection of Africa and antiquity, and insisted for 1,000 years that it belonged to both. And now, after centuries of silence, we are finally listening again. The story of Nubia doesn't end where most stories do. There is no final great battle to mark the close, no dramatic betrayal, no grand collapse worthy of epic verse. Instead, there is a slowdown, a gentle, measured withdrawal from history's center stage. Nubia eventually became a memory encased in stone. Its pyramids, unlike their Egyptian cousins, were built not to impress with size, but to assert existence. Dozens of them rise from the desert like a forest of worn teeth, steep, precise, and defiant. They don't boast, they simply endure. After Meroë fell silent, Nubia fractured into smaller kingdoms. Christianity took root in some regions. In others, Islam spread along the trade routes. The temples of Amun were repurposed or left to the wind. The script was forgotten. And for nearly 1,000 years, the great kingdoms of Kush and Meroë were relegated to the status of myth. Western scholarship, when it came, often arrived late and ill-informed, shaped more by colonial expectations than curiosity.
Today, the ruins of Nubia are undergoing a kind of quiet resurrection. Archaeologists from Sudan, Europe, and around the world have returned to the sands with softer hands and sharper questions. New technologies are helping to uncover not just the buildings, but the rhythms of life that once filled them. Pottery shards reveal trade routes. Fragments of charcoal tell us of the forests that once stood where the desert now stretches. Slowly, the silence is yielding a history. And that history is more than a footnote to Egypt. Nubia had its own gods, its own script, its own cities, built not in imitation, but in evolution. The kings of Kerma, the pharaohs of Kush, the queens of Meroë. These were not provincial players trying to catch up to the Mediterranean. They were the rulers of a civilization born of the Nile that ran parallel to Egypt, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in alliance, but always on its own terms. They built temples where no one else thought to build. They ruled with women when other courts barely allowed them to speak.
the legacy of Nubia is not one of tragic decline, but of quiet persistence. The silence left by Nubia is not an empty one. It is filled with expectation. And perhaps that is the final lesson of this long, slow history. Civilizations do not vanish. They change form. They disappear from the records of those who are not looking, but they persist in the stone, in the story, in the earth itself. Nubia was not erased. It was overlooked. And now, slowly, respectfully, it is being seen again. So, if you ever find yourself near the pyramids of Meroë, as the sun begins to set and the sky turns bronze over the desert, take a moment, pause, and listen. There is a silence there, yes, but it is not emptiness. It is the sound of 1,000 years, still warm beneath your feet. And that, in the end, is what history is. Not just the names we remember, but the ones we finally learn to hear.